Hi everyone, welcome back to part two. What I'm going to do now is to give you a very brief overview of the history of museums and the history of practices of collecting, because the history of the collector feeds into the history of the curator, and I want you to understand this before we get to this point of what does contemporary curation do. There's a number of key questions we have to ask, and a lot of those have to do with the kinds of objects that we put into museums and the kinds of ways that we go about classifying and grouping those objects. The pages in front of you, you can see, is a series of boards made by a German researcher called Abbie Warburg. And what he did is he made these huge pin boards where he grouped together typologies, things that sort of felt and looked the same. And in doing that, he gave us a very clear sense of the Renaissance and the kinds of concerns and interests that happened in the Renaissance. But if you look really closely at these boards, you can see that there are also contemporary, for his time, news articles included there as well, and medieval texts. So although his focus was on the Renaissance, he was expanding time to really think about some of these things that he considered to be sort of essential human attributes. Now, Warburg's work gives us a way of thinking and engaging with this question about what kinds of objects should be in museums, and also what kinds of behaviours objects have when they're in museums. Now, all of this is premised by the fact that up until a few weeks ago, museums around the world were doing incredibly well. Museums were cultural gathering spaces, often at the centre of a city, and many people, if they were a tourist or a visitor to a city, would go to the museum. Now, this is a narrative that we have to really carefully revisit now, because we have to think about in what way are museums and galleries going to continue this exponential growth. If any of you haven't seen it yet, the Banksy film, Exit Through the Gift Shop, is a great analysis of the contemporary museum and the role of art in contemporary society. The kinds of museums that we're used to seeing in contemporary art do not tend to look like this. But actually, this is the history of the so-called public museum. This is an image by Zoffany of the Uffizi in Florence. And you can see that inside the Uffizi, there are learned gentlemen all engaging with the question of what art might be. But in doing that, they're also engaging with the question of what society might be and what culture might be. Now, this is immediately a flawed picture. I've already talked to you about the way that Zoffany's earlier and other images of the Royal Academy in London were particularly gendered. And once again, you can see Titian's Venus of Uberno there, and you can see that all the women who are present are present as images, are present to be viewed and looked at. But there's another layer here as well as the gendering of this space. There's also a very particular kind of racial profile that's occurring here, and that is of the white European male, the gatherer and collector of information and knowledge, the centre of the universe. Now, this story remains inside our public galleries and our public spaces today. It might not look like this, it might look quite different, but the question continues to be asked: what kinds of objects should be in museums and art galleries, and how should they behave? What kinds of installation practices should we have, and how might they reflect on the work, the artist, the cultural context, and the environment? This image is of the National last year at Carriage Works, and in the foreground you can see a series of desert paintings from the central desert region, and these were exhibited flat on the ground as a way of challenging the continual approach to Aboriginal desert paintings of placing them as iconic objects up on the wall. In the background you can see what looks like a walkway, but it was actually a work by Michael Stevenson that sort of generated two spaces that one could move between. So in this exhibition, the curator is placing together these paintings from the desert with this work by Stevenson, and both of them are questioning space, both of them are questioning the way that an object might behave inside the gallery. And the reason for this is connected to this bigger history of what a museum is and what an art gallery is. Museums traditionally have worked to take on all of these roles. So a museum isn't simply some walls with some art inside it or some objects inside it. Instead, a museum is a site for the preservation and conservation and classification of culture. It's a space that is given authority by us as a community, and we say, yes, what goes into this space deserves to be preserved, and yes, what goes into this space deserves to be classified and looked after in a particular way. Shugeyuki Kihara is an artist who questions directly this relationship of preservation, conservation, classification, and power. This series of self-portraits challenges the kinds of bodies and the kinds of images that might be seen inside an art gallery, and also the kinds of classifications that they might undergo. Now, all of this is about identifying the museum as a site of power and authority. What usually goes into a museum maintains authority and gathers authority by its mere presence there. A museum is also itself a monument, as well as often what goes inside it is monumental. Think of those works that we looked at in the first few lectures. They were often quite monumental in the Tate Turbine Hall. So all of these things add up to this very strange combination where we have a site that is a site of power and authority, but that is also based in a notion of spectacle and immersion. So the gallery immerses us inside its walls, inside its stories, inside its illusions, at the same time that it tells us those illusions and stories are real, that they're the stories that have authority. Now, what I want you to do is to have a look at this video called White at the Museum. That is a really fantastic kind of critique of everything I've talked about so far, and much more interesting than me. And have a look at it and think about also the final step in a museum is who's allowed in, who has the authority to enter the spaces of the museum. And I guess what I'm interested in at the moment is how is that changing? Is there actually an opening up of the museum space because we're operating in these new virtual spaces? Does the Google Arts and Culture kind of ownership of all gallery spaces at the moment, does that offer more accessibility or less? So please have a look at this video and then keep listening to me. Okay, so the video draws on this history of the museum. And as Charles Samarai Smith says here, the original intention behind the establishment of museums was that they removed artifacts from their context of ownership and use, from circulation, and instead put them into a new kind of environment where they were provided with a different kind of meaning. So to separate something from its use function, to separate it from circulation, the stories that it has and maintains inside culture, and move it into a gallery space, often severed those ties, but added a layer of authority to the stories that were being told. Now, often these stories drew on a series of curatorial practices. And there's two that I've kind of used already to talk about, taxonomy and typology. Now, looking at this picture in front of you, you would all go, yes, that's logical. Of course, all of those things belong together. The reason they belong together is because you're looking at them through their typology. They have similarities. They're all old fossil bones. So we can say, yes, this is a typological arrangement. These objects are similar. They belong together inside the same kind of museum. We wouldn't expect to see any of these in a museum of contemporary art. An arrangement according to taxonomy shifts this a little bit and thinks about what we consider to be natural relationships. Now, these objects are also grouped according to taxonomy. They are all sections of an animal. The fact that they might sort of span a time period of many millions of years is irrelevant to this organizational structure. We all kind of accept them as museum objects. We accept that their relationships are natural, and we also accept that these objects share some kind of similarity. We also accept that these structures are the ones that make sense to us. But there's a whole background to this. Why should this way of organizing the world and organizing the objects in the world make sense? The history of this comes back to the history of the museum, the history of colonization, and the history of collection. So for a long time, animals and people were collected in order to be able to distinguish certain things. And this practice of colonial collecting was at its very worst as Europe travelled the planet trying to identify something about the world, trying to unpack and understand the world. So here we have a collection of finches, all grouped together because they are all finches, but also all distinct, all standing in for a particular typology. And alongside that, I've put some slides from a practice that was prevalent at the same time, which was trying to analyze people's facial features and understand how those facial features actually were also a type, a kind. So the sense that you would have men convicted of larceny without violence, and they would of course all look the same, but slightly different, just like the finches. And it's this kind of understanding of organizational structures that was gifted to us from the European Enlightenment that informs and structures our museums today. And hopefully you're going, this is a problem. But it's still a structure that we use to think about all objects. So how do we pull these things together? How do we pull together this idea of the object, the relationship between the object, and the relationship with the museum? It's really difficult. It's really difficult to kind of understand how we can challenge this history of collecting, this history of the museum that is based in deeply racist and gendered approaches to society and culture. How do we pull that together with what we believe a contemporary museum to be? So here's Terry Smith. You can be a museum or you can be contemporary, but you can't be both. So what does this mean for, say in Sydney, the Museum of Contemporary Art? What does that say? How do we reconcile this statement? Is the answer to think about what can and can't be in a museum? What can and can't fit into the different classification systems of the museum itself? Now, this is a work by Douglas Gordon from 2003 that, for me, starts to answer many of these questions. The work is a video installation, as you can see. There are 3 screens inside the space. In 2 of the large screens, you see these images of an elephant that walks into the space and lies down. On the very small screen, you see the elephant outside of the gallery space doing whatever it is that elephants do. The work is called Play Dead Real Time, And it's that use of the word dead that actually really sort of catches in my throat, like makes me think about how and why this work just feels so sad, so awkward, and also just really, I guess it really challenges the way that I think about what should and shouldn't go on inside the white cube of the gallery. For this elephant, the experience right now is really no different to what the experience is usually for a performing elephant. The elephant is in no harm, is under no danger. It's just about the tension between the white cube gallery space and the elephant that makes us go, this animal should not be here. So Gordon wants to play with these boundaries. He wants us to think about what it is that the white cube does to the kinds of objects and animals and people and behaviours that we place into these spaces. And he starts to open up the beginning of a discussion around what should and shouldn't be in a contemporary art gallery. And I think opens up a sort of a challenge to Terry Smith. And actually says, yes, I can be contemporary and I can operate using the structures and understandings of a museum because I can push at it and I can challenge its boundaries. So what I'm talking about is these tensions between what we believe should be in a museum and what we believe should be in an art gallery, and where that classification border is also established. Another work that really pushes at these boundaries for me is this work by Fiona Partington, where she went to museums around the world and gathered together a set of life casts. So these are like plaster casts made of living individuals, important individuals. The life casts were made and returned to museums in Paris and other places around the world as well. Partington goes to them and photographs them in a particular way that sort of gives us a new sense of the works, a new sense of how the work reflects an individual or a person, and shifts them from the dusty old colonial museum space into the challenging and challenged spaces of contemporary art. By gathering together these life casts, photographing them in a very plain blank studio environment, it's as if we start to look at these again and start to understand something of the processes and practices of collecting. And we're also given a chance to challenge that and to think about how and why these forms of classification occurred. Now, these photographs, when they're exhibited in the gallery, are enormous. So Partington scales this work up. Here's an image of them with people so you can see. Scales them up to such an extent that we are forced to have a different kind of relationship with them. And what she's doing is very much challenging the spaces of the gallery and challenging those taxonomical classification systems that say this belongs here and this belongs here. Instead, she's saying, no, we need to redress this. We need to look at who and why and how and the power structures and the representational structures of the gallery and how we can start to challenge those and bring those into the contemporary space. So what I've tried to do is to give you a sense of this problematic colonial history of the museum and the art gallery, and also the way that contemporary art begins to challenge the practices of the gallery and also critique the walls and spaces of the gallery. What I'm going to do next is to bring into this debate a question of the actual white walls of the gallery now. So where we've got to so far is we're starting to think about what objects do and don't belong in a gallery, what kinds of galleries they belong in. I'm starting to introduce you to the way that contemporary art operates as a form of critique inside the gallery space. How artists like Partington represent the colonial collecting enterprise and challenge it, make it other to what it was. I want you to think about and continue to notice how taxonomy and typology influence all spaces that we operate inside, and how curators are working to transform the objects. By moving a carrot into a carrot room, the object becomes transformed by being placed on a plinth, by having a label that says carrot. This is the action of the curator. And the question that I want you to start thinking about now, and in part 3 of this lecture, is, do we still need the white walls? How do we address and challenge the spaces of the gallery itself? Okay, I'm going to stop here and I'll see you in a minute for part 3.